Hey, everybody. Welcome to our SMPTE meeting for October. I am Tony Miracker, the section chair in Toronto. Tonight's meeting is sponsored by SMPTE Toronto, and our meeting tonight is things that they didn't tell you about modern virtual production technology. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but we've got some great presentations tonight. Stosh, Savina, and Jeff were the co-organizers for tonight's meeting. Stosh will be driving the ship for us. And then we've got presenters from Studio 37 and LOLED Virtual, Andy and Gary, respectively. So Stosh, I'm going to throw this over to you after we're going to do some questions during and after. Stosh will be monitoring the chat room. So either the chat room or the question box, you can use that to get the questions to us. We will have questions also at the end of the presentation, and off we go. So Stosh, I'm going to hand it over to you, and I'm going to douse myself.
All right, thank you very much, Tony. Welcome, everyone. Nice to see all of you, well, all of your names anyways on the virtual list here. First, a shout out to two of the newest members to the Toronto Section Board who were my co-organizers on tonight's meeting. Silvino Almeida from Skyline Tech Communications, and of course, Jeff Vella from Revel Broadcast and IT. Together, we were able to put this together, and we look forward to a great night tonight. As Tony said, please, while we're going, it's going to be somewhat informal. If you have questions on some of the content that Andy and Gary are talking through, they'll be playing off each other throughout, so it won't be two separate presentations. It'll be the two of them together, Andy leading the charge and Gary adding where appropriate. So drop your questions in the question and answer and or the chat. Gary and I will be monitoring those, and we'll interject as appropriate. So first up, the meeting tonight is the things they didn't tell you about modern virtual production technology. It's not your granddad's green screen anymore. There's a lot more going on. So we don't want to steal any of their thunder. With that, we'll jump right in. First up, Gary Adcock with Studio 37 Inc. Just to get into their bios, few exemplify the changing technological landscape in digital cinema more than Gary Adcock, with a unique understanding of on-set tech and their relationship in post-production has allowed him to act as a guide in the evolving relationship between acquisition, edit, and delivery. Gary is one of the co-authors and tech editor for the original version of the Data Handling Procedures and Best Practices Guide used by Local 600. Gary has been a speaker on cinematography and related technologies at events around the world and has presented it on various topics at the NAB Las Vegas convention continuously since 1999, as well as presenting on a diverse array of subjects at NAB Shanghai, IBC, Interb, and Broadcast India. His knowledge and capabilities keep him in demand as both a consultant and technical writer for a wide array of manufacturers and publications.
Well, thank you. I'm done. I'm out of here.
Boom. And joining Gary on the virtual stage today is Andy Jarros of LOLED Virtual Inc. Andy is a cinema tool creator and virtual production supervisor in Chicago. His 15 years of on-set experience and passion for innovation give him a well-rounded, forward-looking view of the film industry, and he works closely with numerous cinema companies to identify and solve problems in virtual production. And his Chicago-based firm, LOLED, designs hardware and software solutions for camera interfacing used on virtual productions worldwide. With that, I give you guys Andy and Gary. I will let Andy's going to drive the presentation from here. I will mute my video and turn it over to our presenters. Thank you, guys.
And as we get going, just a reminder for everybody, we understand there's going to be a lot of questions. Don't hesitate to ask them. I'll jump in a little times and help out and help Andy just explain some things. But we've done this a couple of times now, and it's a lot of fun. And we want you to just kind of learn from it. And with that, I'll get out of the way and let Andy go for a bit.
Yeah, thanks. No, yeah, Gary is the glue of the presentation. Yeah, thanks, guys. It's awesome to be here. This is what they don't tell you about virtual production. And basically the idea behind this initially came about because I found that I was answering the same like 5 emails over and over again. There's a lot of misconceptions and questions about this technology. And so I wanted to kind of put a presentation together to peel back the curtain and tell everyone what the state of the art really is right now, and what some of the problems that we're facing are, and where I think that we're headed. Who am I? I think that the bio went really well, but I am a virtual production supervisor and consultant here in Chicago, and I work with productions, and I work with manufacturers, and I work on set. So I have kind of a holistic view of filmmaking in general that I use to sort of bounce ideas around. This is a reel of just some stuff we've done. I have not much to talk over, but I guess one of the things I'll mention as well is LOLED, like I said, designs hardware as well. And this hardware is used on productions all over the world. So again, this sort of interfaces us with customers as well. So I have a surprising amount of people that I talk with on a regular basis about just their workflows, because I'm trying to build products that fit their workflows.
Well, and Andy, let me just jump in here for a minute too, because you're also, you're also building props and sets for people. You've worked on lots of major motion pictures for All Mankind. I mean, there's a lot of television production you've worked on. So your background is helping to create visual effects and work in the visual effects space. So,
yes.
So that, just to let everybody know, it's like, and he took that from building props and everything to actually building the tools that he needed to start working in virtual production. And the encoder that he's talking about is actually one of the most popular low-end encoders for people to get started with, and it solves a lot of problems. And I actually work with Andy on some of his plug-in technology that he's using for Unreal Engine. So it goes really deep like that. So I'll let you jump back in. You're showing your bitmap, your mapping here. Let's let you go.
3D scanning stuff. This is just a little reel that we put together to show people, because it's one of these things where this is actually one of the major hurdles is people who are super new to this technology. It's hard to sort of wrap your head around. And so it's not until you get a camera in the hands, you show them a photo of it in action, that they actually fully understand what's going on. But when we talk about virtual production, what are we talking about? Because the term virtual production is as broad of a term as filmmaking is. You could be a documentary filmmaker, you could make feature films, right? They're very different things. Virtual production, historically, until a couple of years ago, has meant typically either green screen or XR, using CG elements to extend something in real life, usually for events or sports or broadcast, things like that. It's not until the last few years that we've had LED walls, and that LED walls have gotten good enough to look good on camera, and that we've been able to push that sort of fidelity. So my background is in film and TV. It's a narrative work, not so much in broadcast or events. And so that's kind of the angle that I come at things from. But it's worth saying that virtual production extends everywhere. There's a lot more to it than just LED walls in Unreal Engine right now.
Well, and that brings up an interesting point, because people don't apply that terminology in this space that way. They think it's all about The Mandalorian and big budget productions and all of that.
Yeah.
We've seen documentaries now being done this way. We did one in Chicago a couple of months ago. We think it's one of the first ones here. So it's interesting to see that people think this technology is really, really expensive, when in reality it can be done, particularly on a test and developmental level, very, very inexpensively. Little more than a television monitor and a miniature set, and somebody who understands how Unreal works. You can actually start working with that already to build your kind of tool set to be able to do this.
No, absolutely. Yeah. An Unreal Engine is free, which is awesome. It's a weird situation, but why it's free? Because, Fortnite and everything, but it's awesome that it is. Anyone can download it and just start playing with it. And you can develop a, career based on that alone. And many people have.
And that actually brings up an interesting point, Andy, because that literally is a new job position for, that hasn't been defined by the union yet. But, World Builder is actually somebody that actually has to do this. So in the gaming world, you're bringing in people that are building these environments in that. But if you're talking about virtual production, you now have to have competent modelers and scene designers that can actually build these environments prior to production starting, because you have to deliver when production starts. So it's a whole new level of technology that's built into this part of the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm gonna structure this into sort of a series of myths. Again, just sort of like misconceptions that I've heard and I've spoken with people about, and I've talked with producers about and things like that. So myth number one is that virtual production is cheap. And I know that we just said it was cheap to get started, but when you scale it up to Mandalorian, it starts to get expensive. And so said I was pulling back the curtain. So here's some prices. This is going to vary depending on what you get and your location and probably time of year and things like that. But I think there's a good general average prices. But you can see 18-inch by 18-inch LED panel, $200 a week. LED processors, about $700 a week. You need one LED processor for every 200 panels-ish, depending on the pixel pitch. Camera tracking, $2 to $5 grand a week. American dollars, by the way. I think I should point that out. So not pictured here, obviously, media servers, which could vary drastically in labor, obviously. But I'm not sure where this misconception came from, but a lot of people, especially when this first started becoming a thing, there was a lot of people saying like this is going to revolutionize the indie film scene and things like that. And maybe it will. I hope it will. But at least right now, this is kind of the point that we're at. But it's important to remember that even if your bottom line is the same, it displaces a lot of other money because you're saving. You don't have to lock up locations. You don't have to figure out how you're going to transport crew to locations. You're not waiting on light. You're not waiting on airplanes. You're not waiting on weather. And you have a lot more creative control. And so you are potentially saving a lot of money as well. And you can shoot, a desert scene in the morning and then go to a snowy scene in the afternoon. And it's not like you couldn't do that without virtual production, but it's a lot easier. Choosing which file to load is a lot easier than actually moving your crew somewhere. So that's something to bear in mind.
And one of the other things that comes up in this that's really important that people need to think about is the cost savings for implementations where there's a lot of security. You need to shoot in an airport. You need to shoot, on a military base. There's lots of places where, it might be dangerous to work in that environment, explosions and those kind of things. And so you can now separate the talent from the action, or you can separate the location from the security problem. I mean, trying to shoot in an airport's incredibly difficult, in anywhere in North America. And you have to think about that with the security options. I mean, to walk on an airport where you have Chicago O'Hare, it's a $50 million insurance charge just to be able to walk out there. Well, now we can build that in there. We don't have to worry about any of the security restraints. And that brings an interesting level on it. Or think about working with children where you can, you no longer have to take them out to location. You don't have to worry about night shoots with children. You can actually build the environment there and get an entire, 6-hour day with a child and not lose any time based on, locations or anything else. So there's a lot of advantages to it also.
And Local 476 just sent out an email the other day. There are neighborhoods in Chicago that are essentially being burned out on filming. They're filmed in so often that the residents are starting to get angry. And so the Chicago Film Office keeps a heat map of different locations and is actually going to start shutting down shows that are shooting at certain locations too much. And so you can imagine this is the perfect solution to that. We can go out, we could scan a location, and you have that forever, and you don't have to worry about that at all.
Well, and that brings up another alternate use of this is, you've got a set built and you could go scan the set to be able to do inserts or pickups, and then not have to store the set on a live stage for 3 or 4 months while you're waiting for post to complete. Yeah. I mean, that's a viable opportunity too. And a huge cost saving in an environment we're in right now where production is so prevalent that people are fighting for stage space.
Yes, exactly. And so, yeah, even though you could be looking at 5 figures a day, I've heard big stages being even more than that. There's a lot more to consider than just money in this case. Myth number 2, virtual production is easy. So there's a video here. I'm not going to play the whole video, but it's one of these videos that's like everything was shot in one location. This one is also about like green. It's like, wow, we can go anywhere. Look, we're driving. Wow, we're here. Look, the sun's moving. We can move the sun with an iPad. And there's a lot of videos like this because of course there are, because it's cool technology. People are excited. People are trying to sell it. But it does, I have found, give a sense that this is some sort of turnkey, easy solution when it's not. We're building a house of cards here. We're plugging things in together that have never been plugged in before, and we're building it as we go. And that's just the state of it right now. Eventually, it's going to get better. But right now, it's still very much a work in progress. The technology is still being developed, and it's important to realize that there are things that aren't going to work 100% reliably, which is weird on a film set where we're used to everything needing to work 100%. Virtual production is multidisciplinary. There's people that are coming in from the games industry or other industries that may not be used to working on film sets, that don't understand our terminology and things like that. And so there's a communications barrier there as well. And also, these are game engines. It's not like we're dealing with a piece of software that was specifically designed for video use, right? Or for film use, like say Premiere or Resolve or something, right? This was designed to make video games, and we've commandeered it to make movies. And there are certain fundamental design decisions within Unreal Engine that make it not ideal for that purpose. But we're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Well, and isn't it true that as we start talking about, as this grows with Unreal Engine 5 and what NVIDIA is doing with Omniverse, which is using their 3D CAD applications and 3D modeling applications that are used for cars and oil wells and everything else, that's bringing a new level of complexity to the art. And it's moving it out of just the game engine world into actually bringing into full realized actual production models. Andy, one of the questions that come up from Brad Dickinson is, it talks about projecting content in the foreground. Have you done any of that? I mean, I've seen the disguise workflows on that, where you actually have objects in the foreground that are projected or virtual there. Have you ever done any of that? I know I haven't, but
yeah, I've seen people talk about this. The problem with it, obviously, projection mapping has been around for a long time, and it's been around for a long time for special events and things like that. But the problem with it for film use is that projectors get washed out super easily, right? If you were just shooting the projection mapping, fine. But if you are using it as part of a scene and you're going to light the scene, then your lights are going to wash out your objects, and there's not much you can do about that. And so it's not ideal. Additionally, it's not like you're going to get that much depth to it. Like, if you're going to have foreground objects and this is a genuine, real project, a movie or something, you're probably just going to build it, right? It's not that big of a deal just to build it as a set piece.
Well, and the reality of it too is that those real foreground objects actually add to it. You've got foreground objects, you've got the talent, and you've got near background objects that are not necessarily the wall information, the volume information, but physical objects back there that add to the illusion of depth. You don't get that illusion of depth with a projected object in the foreground that you do with with real physical objects that you can move around. And remember too that you're using a third of the production set that you used to be. I mean, you're using a few objects that are relative to what's going on, and the rest of it's in the background.
Yeah. And remember that you are getting, depth, quote unquote, because you are getting that full parallax from tracking the camera and things like that. Mm-hmm. So there's not necessarily that much, I think, use that you would get out of projection mapping, something that you couldn't just get out of bringing in the object for real or relying on that parallax. Mm-hmm. Computer, there we go. Myth 3, LED screens. They're a myth. No. This is just general things about LED screens. With some quirks and some things that people don't necessarily consider. But when you look at a specific LED screen, a specific brand, whether it's like a Row or an Aoto or Unilumin or whatever, they have different specs. And those specs obviously affect how good it looks on camera. So the main spec, the one that's the big advertised one, is the pixel pitch, which is the distance between LED emitters. I think I have a panel here somewhere. I don't know, I'll find it in a sec. It's the distance between LED emitters. So here's a piece of an LED panel. Each white dot is an LED. Good job, Zoom. And the distance between them is the pixel pitch. The tighter the pixel pitch, so the smaller the number, in general, the higher the resolution will be. And so the sharper the screen will be able to be without getting moire, and the closer the camera will be able to be before it stops resolving it as an image and instead of sees it as a series of dots. But it's not a one-to-one trade-off. It's not like, oh, tighter pixel pitch, always better. Even though manufacturers, obviously, because they're more expensive, want to sell you on the tighter pitch screens, there's other factors as well. The big one is going to be the fill ratio. So how big are the LEDs? You can have two different LED screens from two different manufacturers with the same pixel pitch, and they could look very different on camera just because of that fill factor. because you could still get more at different points. It's not like a hard and fast rule. Additionally, the tighter the pixel pitch, like I said, the higher the resolution, the more processing power you need, and the more controllers you need, like Brompton controllers. So it goes up, the price goes up across the board as well. And typically, like there's other things as well. Usually, the tighter the pixel pitch is, the less bright the screen is, and the worse the scan rate is, which we'll get into later on, even more detail. But brightness is the other one that a lot of people don't, I think, put as much stock into that I think that they should, because the brightness is effectively the dynamic range that the screen can present to camera, right? If the ratio between the brightest point of your screen and the darkest point is 10:1, well, that's effectively 10 stops of dynamic range that it's able to display. And so I think a lot of people don't put a lot of stock in brightness, or they don't treat it as they should, which is, you're trying to emulate reality. And so that spec kind of falls by the wayside a lot. And then the other one is scan rate. Scan rate is different from refresh rate. LED screens usually have quite high refresh rates, like 2 to 8,000 hertz I've seen. Scan rate is different. Scan rate is the amount of LEDs that are lit up if you were to stop time within that refresh rate, kind of like a rolling shutter is on a camera. And so the scan rate is expressed in a fraction. That fraction is, generally speaking, the amount of pixels that are lit up at any given point. So if it's 1:1, that means that every pixel is lit up at all times. If it's 1/20, only 1 in 20 pixels is lit up. And so what that means is, for virtual production use, we want it to be as close to 1:1 as possible, because we are dealing with cameras that have rolling shutters, and that means that you don't want the camera to catch the screen mid-refresh. You'll get artifacts, you'll get flicker, and you'll get banding. Even if you're gen locked, if it's a particularly bad screen, you will still get artifacts if the scan rate is bad enough. So in general, most times, like the realistic scan rates, the ones that are actually attainable, are usually in like the 1.8 to 1.16 range, and those look good on camera. Anything beyond that, and it's going to be a case of your mileage may vary. It's not that they can't look good; it's just that you're taking a risk. The higher your scan rate goes.
It shows up in places where you're not necessarily looking at it. It doesn't show up in the brightest point. It shows up in the corner in the shadows where you've got an irregular pattern and things like that. And that's the kind of thing that can bite someone really bad on a production, and they don't even know where to look.
Yeah, absolutely. And the unfortunate thing is the scan rate is often buried by manufacturers, because they know that that's the spec that can make or break the sale of their product for the people that are in the know. And so they'll hide it. And I've been looking at panels, and I'll ask the manufacturer straight up, I'll call them, and they'll have no idea what I'm talking about, because a lot of times even their salespeople don't understand it. So it's really important to figure it out and to look into it.
I want to go back to processors for a second.
Yeah.
Just so everybody understands what he means by that. Stay here for a second. And as you get more and more resolution, to be able to power that large a space, you have to then start dividing the screen up into 50, 100 panels to be able to control them. And then you need another computer just to control the processors that are all linked together running 4K now. So it's one of the things that you need to think about as you start expanding this and getting higher resolution. It's the support systems for the CPUs and the GPU processing that actually start to be a limiting factor for a lot of productions. It's not how the screens are built, it's how many computers can you actually push this data through to be able to play in real time on the screen.
Yes. Yep, absolutely. Okay.
Keep going.
There's a bunch of quirks about LED screens that a lot of people also don't realize. This one is obvious to us, in the know, but it still blows the minds of people on a regular basis. But the screen can't be in focus. If you focus on the screen, as you'll see, you'll get moire. And this is actually a mosaic of different pixel pitches of tiles that we did just to test at what point they kind of become unusable. At longer focal lengths, I think this is an 80 on a full frame sensor, you can see that even when it's quite out of focus, you still get this kind of like banding artifact. You can see, especially like in the gradients here. And that's because the longer lens is effectively acting as a magnifying lens for these pixels. And so the image is not as acceptable than on wide shots. But conversely, on wide lenses, you also have a tougher time getting a shallow depth of field. And so there's definitely a trade-off there. And this, it's been interesting because I've had conversations with people where they're like, if you can't focus on the screen, then what's the point of this, right? And like they're thinking that the LED screen is their environment. The best way to think about it is it's a translate, or it's a green screen replacement, right? It is extending your set. It is not specifically your set. And that's not to say that you can't make it work as your set, but you're going to run into issues like this. Basically, camera placement becomes more important, and you have to start thinking about things like focal length more often. Whereas if you have, say, a larger screen, Mandalorian size screen, it's huge and past the hyperfocal distance of your camera, then you don't have to worry about it necessarily. You do have to worry about other things that we'll get into in a second. Cork 2, studio lighting is your enemy. This one I see so often. So often I see videos of people and their screens are just so washed out. And it's once you know what to look for, it like becomes, you can't unsee it, because this is one of the huge mistakes that so many people make when they're first shooting on an LED volume, is they just don't control their spill. And so they have lights hitting the screen. And as you can see on the LED panel, around the LEDs is this black mask. It's just plastic. And if light hits it, it will illuminate just like as if you were lighting plastic. And so you get these sort of hot spots and this kind of asymmetric nature of it. And you can see here with the panels off, or I guess we're behind a wall. You can see like we're catching some like gap in the screen here. Here there's an angle. And so this whole, the right section of the screen here is just brighter than the left. And then on the bottom left, there is a hotspot, where the key light is sort of hitting it. And this shows up as just different hotspots around the screen. It's really hard to remove in post. It might not even be possible to remove in post because, again, it's only affecting the black mask around the pixels. So this is from a YouTube video by a channel called Gaffer and Gear. And this is just a good manifestation of this. You could see the black PVC jacket of the guy in the foreground and how black it is compared to the blacks of the background. Even though the blacks in the background should be just as underexposed, the black levels are very different. And it's a dead giveaway that you're looking at a screen. Something else, I didn't put this arrow in, this arrow was part of their video, but it is pointing out a overexposed light fixture that is overexposed in Unreal Engine terms, but is not overexposed enough in camera to actually, have gone white. And so it's not quite accurate. It could be a color grading thing as well, but I think it's more likely it's a screen thing. And so we're going to get into this more in depth in a second here, but there's just, a lot of these quirks you need to look out for. And avoid light spill. Use grids, use snoots, use flags, everything you can.
Well, and that's an interesting point, because it's like everybody thinks it's like, oh, the wall's going to light everything up. It's like, no, you need a gaffer who understands how to mask the light. And one of the things I've seen that's really surprised me is how much, double, triple egg crates on sky panels and things like that. Lots of, French flags and all that kind of stuff being used to keep all this light off the screen. And that's a fundamental need that I don't think people talk enough about, is having the ability to shoot this, but also control the light in such a way that there's no spill.
Yeah, it is important. And one of the, this is also something, like a lot of times, for whatever reason, one of the questions that, producers have asked me is like, well, what size screen do I need? And that's one of those like unanswerable questions. Like, well, what are you trying to shoot? Where are you going to shoot it? Blah, 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 blah. But this is one of the driving factors of it, because in order to not light the screen, your talent needs to be a certain distance from the screen, right? And so if you are planning on shooting and you need to get this angle with the subject this size in frame, well, the screen needs to be 15 feet beyond that. So that's going to be one of the factors that drives how big your screen needs to be. So Cork 3, asymmetric depth of field. So this is a top-down view of just a simple blender shot. But in the bottom right, there is a camera, and the center is a monkey head. And then on the left, that orange line is a screen. And so you can see that the camera is at quite an angle to the screen. And so if you were to shoot this, you would get this, understandably, where the left of the screen is more in focus than the right of the screen. And that makes sense. The screen's falling off, and so it's going to become more out of focus. And that's fine, except that remember that in virtual production, we're tracking the camera and we are projecting the virtual image from the perspective of the camera, correcting for that perspective. So to the camera, there is no fall off. The image is just always straight on, as though you were in real life. And so you get this scenario. This is a little bit hard to see, but on the left, you can see those trees are more in focus than the trees that are on the right, even though if you were really in this wide open field, everything would be uniformly out of focus. And so this is just a physical effect of shooting things off angle, and you're going to get this. And again, it's tricky because with virtual production, when you're on an LED volume, you want to shoot wide open a lot of the time to make sure the background's blurry enough that you don't get the moire. And so this just sort of exacerbates it. Shooting off angle is generally not a great idea if you can avoid it. Or again, if your screen's big enough and it's past your hyperfocal distance, and you're fine. Something else, I don't have this in the slide here, but something else to consider is the screen layout. So a lot of times I've seen people build like these tiny, like 20-foot U curved screens because they can. But the thing is that unless you're always in the dead center of that screen, if you are shooting outside of a U-shaped screen, that means that the edges are always going to be closer to camera than the center. And so your edges are always going to be sharper than the center in that case. So the way the screen is laid out relative to the camera and the size of everything kind of becomes important, because you'll sort of magnify or change this effect depending on the scene that you're shooting. A lot of times, just a flat wall is the best choice. For exposure. So we talked about brightness earlier, and I talked about how important I think brightness is. And so there's a few just sort of like axioms here. Number one, cameras see a certain amount of dynamic range, 13 to 16, 17 stops. Number two, LED screens, any screen, outputs a certain amount of dynamic range, right? This is why HDR is a thing. It's high dynamic range. The brighter the screen, the wider the dynamic range that the screen can output. Again, HDR screens, the brighter. The closer that the screen is to reality, the better it will look to camera. And when I mean reality, I don't mean reality according to camera or according to our eyes. I mean reality as it truly is. The closer we can get the screen to empirical reality, which is what the camera is used to shooting, the more natural and realistic the image will look. And so this is not to scale, but this is just to show you guys the relative, buckets of dynamic range of various things. We have real life, an unquantifiable amount of dynamic range, I'm sure. Within that, the camera can see a subset. Within that, the LED screen can output a subset, and eventually Rec 709. And I know Rec 2020, et cetera, but for now, 709. Quirk 4. So a lot of times what will happen is, let's say that we have an LED screen at 50% brightness. Again, completely arbitrary. These are not real values, but effectively a smaller amount of dynamic range, relatively speaking. And then we expose to counter that effect that I showed you guys earlier, where the black levels are mismatched. So we expose that the black levels are correct for the foreground and the background. Well, effectively, what that means is that we have a scenario where we could place a light, and that light value could go beyond what the max brightness the screen could be outputting is. And so you could have a situation where, kind of like I showed you guys earlier, you can have a light displayed on the screen that appears as though it should be overexposed, and then a backlight or some hot light on your foreground that is actually brighter. And again, there's that mismatch there. Also, there's no data beyond that point, right? So when you go into color grading, there's no like recovering data from the highlights in the screen because there's no data there. Let's say you do the opposite. Let's say you expose so that your highlights line up. Well, now you have the opposite problem. There's no data in your shadows, and you're going to see that problem that we saw earlier, where your shadows are at different levels. Effectively, what you want to do is, so here's another example. Let's say, again, completely arbitrary, screen at 100% brightness or whatever brightness matches what we see here. And you could see that if you were to get on set and you were to see this, and I've seen this happen, your cinematographer is going to go, wow, that screen's really bright. We need to dim down the screen. When what you should be thinking is, wow, that screen's really bright, but it's an outdoor scene. It would be really bright. How would we compensate for this if it were real? You'd use ND filters, or you'd lower your ISO, or you would potentially stop down if you could. And so you do that, and now, look, everything's shifted and it lines up well. And so whatever 709 subset of that you take, you will have data to grade, and everything will ideally line up. The best way to do this on set is false color or a waveform monitor, and just making sure that your black levels of your foreground and your screen are the same color and your highlights are the same color. If you have a middle gray card, that's another good thing to do. A common way, I say common, probably the best way right now of just manually calibrating your brightness for an LED volume is to take an HDRI of your set with a gray card in it, and then to display a gray card in your Unreal scene, and then hold a gray card next to the screen, and then adjust your levels until they match. It's tedious and it's not always possible because the screens have really bad color rendition and lower bit depth than reality, obviously. But it's a good way to get in close. So yeah, this is something that a lot of people don't really consider, but I think is super, super important. So moving on. Myth 4, virtual production is fast. This is an interesting one because producers are used to picking up the phone and making things happen. And so this is one of those things where they can't do that, and it can be kind of frustrating to them. And I've spoken with people where that's frustrating to them, but it's not like you can do this on a whim, right? It's not like ideally, this is not something you want to keep in your back pocket and use, for the perfect scenario. Like, it's something you want to be actively thinking about and planning around, because that's how you're going to get the best results. That's how everything's going to work best workflow wise. So 3D scanning and environment design takes time. Could take days, could take weeks, depending on the complexity of the environment. There's load in and setup and calibration. It's a tall ask, but we need at least a day on set with the screens and the camera and the lenses, and just that. It's not a set deck day, it's not a pre-light day, it is just a virtual production calibration day, at least one.
And people, stop for a second, because that's one of those things that people sometimes forget about. I mean, it takes a week if it's a big volume, and it's going to take a week to set the screens up to go. But the day of calibration is important because you're aligning the camera systems, the lens, the optics, however you're going to move the camera so that it works in that environment. And it gives you repeatable results in that environment. Because you'll talk in a minute about how we do parallax. And without having a proper camera tracking, parallax doesn't work. It doesn't happen that way. And it's an important part of the step that often gets left out. It's like when people say, oh, you don't need camera prep. This is different than camera prep. This is set prep. And it's after the camera prep.
Yeah, exactly. And for something where you're paying daily, for your rentals and for renting the stage or whatever, obviously they're going to try and minimize their costs. But it's one of those things where this just has to be considered. It's really not optional. Light baking and digital set dressing. So again, a lot of these videos will show you we can move things on the fly, we can change lights on the fly, and to some extent you can, but you want to kind of get most of that done, as much as you can, done in prep. And the reason is because if you make a big change in Unreal or any game engine, you're going to have a scenario where you then have to bake the lighting, which is an offline process. It could take 20, 40 minutes to do, that's Unreal calculating all those light bounces, and saving that all to textures, essentially. So if you want things like soft shadows or bounce lighting in Unreal, that's how you get it. And that happens sort of offline. There's obviously a dynamic lighting system. That's how things like particles work, and some simpler, more basic lights work. But they just don't, they don't look as good. And in my opinion, they don't hold up well as a key lights in terms of photorealism. So that's something ideally you don't want to be fiddling with on set, because then before you know it, it's lunchtime and they're still moving lights around and trees, and the client doesn't know what they want. And sometimes too much power is a bad thing. So offload this as much as you can at the beginning and get it all set so that you get there on the day, you know what you're doing, you know how everything looks.
Planning and pre-production, what can I say?
Yeah, absolutely. It's critical. Myth 5, virtual production is universal. So I mentioned this at the beginning, but until fairly recently, virtual production was not a film thing. It was a broadcast or an event or a sports thing. And so many of the tools, most of the tools that are used and that are around right now are developed with this in mind. And so if you take a system that's designed to be used in a broadcast studio, there's a few assumptions that you can make when you're developing a product for that environment that aren't true in a cinema environment. So in a broadcast environment, your cameras are probably going to be facing upwards, probably not going to be doing too many Dutch angle crazy shots, and they're probably going to be on pedestals or jibs. You're probably not going to be doing gimbal work. I mean, obviously there are crazy camera rigs, but sports stuff mainly, I guess. Usually your studio is going to be set up once, and then only one camera is live at a time. Whereas a narrative, we have creative angles and rigging. Cameras are mounted upside down. We use handheld and Steadicam and all sorts. We go inside of cars and things like that. The setup's changing all the time. Every scene, it's a new setup. And so we're constantly moving things around. And we have multiple cameras shooting simultaneously. And so I've spoken to a lot of media server vendors, for example, and I'm like, okay, so how do we do multiple cameras? And they're like, well, you hook into the switcher, and when the switcher switches, the scene changes. And it's like, but that's not how that, that doesn't work for us. We need multiple cameras shooting at the same time, which we can do with NDisplay. And systems, like Disguise and Pixera can do this as well. But again, thinking about this from like a nuts and bolts tool perspective, broadcast system can make these assumptions. On the left is a camera tracking system that looks at dots on the ceiling, and it can make that assumption that you have a ceiling, right? That's not always valid in a film context. I think it has ports for things like broadcast lenses and things like that. Whereas on the right, it's the Mandalorian, obviously, and there's an OptiTrack tree on there, which is just some retroreflective markers. It's a dumb system, a passive system, where there's witness cameras looking at the camera at those markers and can determine its position. But it works upside down. It works, in crazy scenarios, and so it's a lot more flexible for that use. But it's a motion capture solution. It's not intended for camera tracking specifically. There aren't a lot of technologies right now, because the industry is so new, that are specifically dedicated for this use case. Bonus round. Sorry, my computer is lagging out, but I thought that this talk was kind of negative when I made it, so I wanted to just have some cool stuff, like what you can do with virtual production to kind of end on a high note here. But there's a bunch of cool things that you can do that a lot of people don't know about. So one of the most basic ones is what the camera sees can be different from what the rest of the scene is. And so here you can see as the camera is moving around, there's this sort of floating square, and that's we call that the camera frustum. And that is how you get multiple cameras. Each camera just has their own floating square, but what is inside of that square can be different from what's outside of that square. And so you can do things like you can actually see in this example how everything outside is a stop hotter than everything inside. And that casts more ambient light onto the talent that you can actually see there. It helps tie them together into the scene more. You can also do creative things like, what if you make just what the camera sees black and white and everything else is still in color? So you have like a color person in a black and white world. If they have something shiny, reflective, you'd see color reflections in that, but they'd be in a black and white world. Dream sequence, music video, I don't know, free idea. Interleaving multiple scenes. This is done by a company called Ghost Frame, but this is super interesting. What this does, you run your camera at a multiple of your target frame rate, and this interleaves frames, different frames in each alternating frame. And so when in editing, then you just pull out, okay, every A frame is this timeline, every B frame is this timeline, every C frame is this timeline, and each one is different. And so you can shoot multiple angles perhaps. What's exciting to me about this is you can shoot multiple lighting setups. If you have no other lights, you can shoot a daytime scene and a nighttime scene simultaneously of the same scene at the exact same time. Just super cool. This is Brompton just integrated this into their processors as well. This is something that I think is like the next level of in-camera VFX of virtual production. I think we're going to start seeing some really cool uses of this.
Go into the green screen aspect of it too, because that's actually really fascinating for a lot of people, because now you can actually interleave real product with a green screen simultaneously and have both of them shot in real time together. And that's a phenomenal time saver for those applications where you may have to change the background later, but you don't need to for every shot. You only need to do it in a little part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Some other cool things. So you can also, by the way, when we were talking about what the camera sees can be different from the rest of it, you can make just what the camera sees a green screen, and the lighting and reflections can still be in color. Again, huge time saver for VFX. It makes it that much more believable. There are also systems, actually you can see here, where they'll interleave fiducial markers for camera tracking on the screens as well, that are not visible in your final frame, but are visible to camera, which is super cool. Yeah, so that is that's all I got. Some things that I wanted to, oh, sorry, there's a couple of things that I don't have slides for, but I want to just quickly mention.
Go for it.
Since we were talking about color, Gary, color is a big one. The color rendition of LED screens is really bad. It's like a 60 SSI in general. And so you're in this scenario where you kind of have to work to the screens a lot of time. You kind of have to like light and manipulate your camera image to be within the screen's gamut, whatever that might be. And even if you can like calibrate it, you can't really like perfectly calibrate a screen that's literally not capable of producing certain wavelengths. So that's something to bear in mind. And then camera sync is the other thing that we were mentioning before, but
yeah, don't even get me on that one. That's my pet peeve. A whole industry that we work in that doesn't understand the basic principles of what used to be broadcast. Genlock, timecode, Genlock, frame sync is so important. Yes. And it's fundamental here. But the thing about tri-level sync is what people don't seem to get is that you've got a camera running at 23.9A or 25, you've got a computer that's running at 30, and you've got a screen that's running at 59.94, 60, or maybe 50, depending on where you're at in the world. And it's an interesting dichotomy in how, the reality of frame sync has been lost on an entire generation because we forgot how to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a pain. As I've expressed before, the fact that we're still using tri-level sync and time code for these things is bothersome to me. Hopefully a new standard will emerge soon. But a lot of popular cameras like Alexa cameras just don't even have a tri-level sync port, or they do, but you have to send it back to ARRI. And guess what? No one's ever done that in the history of forever. So
in the LF Mini, there's never been one sent back to have a Genlock port put on it.
So it can be a pain. You have to not make any assumptions when it comes to that, is what that essentially means, right? A $6,000 Red Komodo, when you're looking at it from a sync perspective, is better equipped to shoot virtual production than a $30,000 Alexa Mini. So now, obviously there's other factors, but just from a sync perspective, like, it's true. So you can't make any assumptions that like, oh, it's a cinema camera, we're good to go. This is also why prep is important.
And people forget about those little things. I mean, one of the things that I've worked on so much in all of this is trying to interconnect analog cameras and camera systems into virtual world. And with your help, we were able to build, encoder box that actually takes, Zeiss lens data out of a lens and brings it into these things and gives us real-time control from the real world into the virtual world and back. And those kind of things are what's solving some of the issues for all of this. The other thing to think about too is that, and one of the problems, in North America, where a good chunk of the population uses empirical measurements, at least on, down here, and everything in Unreal is metric. And now we have, this variety of lenses that are all encoded in a measuring system that's not what's required for the application at hand. Yep. I always find that one interesting too. Those of us who've been metric for a long time, forget about that, but that's a real problem because a lot of the glass is still marked as imperial markings.
Yep. We're heathens. We haven't evolved.
Well, and that's actually brings up the other part about this, because I've been working on this project and it's like testing all this lens data. And what I found out is that people are so afraid of changing the archaic way that they've actually tested lenses forever. I mean, come on, it's, they pull a tape up and it's like, yeah, it's almost an inch. It's, it's like, that's close enough, kind of thing. Whereas the data-driven side of this is giving me accuracy to, millimeters, and I don't have to think about it. It's accurate and consistent and all those kind of things. And one of the mindsets we have to change as we go forward is understanding that the more we sync the metadata, the camera metadata, the lens metadata, what's going on with the LED displays, how the walls are separated and how they're refreshing, all of that internal data is going to drive how this goes in the future. And that's something we need to think about and really progress towards, because it's funny to me how we still do, an analog lens test where we put a lens up on a chart, we measure it with a ruler, and then we take a picture of it and see if it matches. It's like, the data's all there, and the manufacturers have gone out of their way to start building that kind of technology for us to use. We just haven't utilized it yet.
Yeah, and I think a part of that is that until now it's been inaccessible, and so now we're building tools to be able to access that data.
Well, and a question came up, says, how does the system use all that metadata? Well, it's real simple, because with Zeiss extended data, you're talking about, you get basic phys information, then you get where the aperture is and how big the sensor is after it's married to the camera data. And now you have a system that's actually controlling the visual effects part of all of this. And it's a powerful tool set to be able to do, especially, and think about it, being able to undistort a wide angle lens on the wall and be able to do that, or be able to map something in real time so that the artificial space that you're building then now mimics what the optics are going to do, and you get a more realistic appearance of it. Yeah. I mean, as we do more and more of this, it's about melding the artifice with the real and making that as a single structure. The capabilities of this are virtually unlimited. And it's all kinds of things. And I like to point out this, this is still relatively new technology. One of the first major applications of this was gravity in 2013, where they actually used the screens to light things and light the objects and light that and use it for the space sequences to begin with. It was one of the very first applications of this. And I wonder how much we would be talking about this right now had not pandemic happened and everybody got a chance to watch The Mandalorian in real time.
I mean, yeah, I've heard, that we're 3 years ahead of where we should be, quote unquote, because of the pandemic just accelerated it. Also, the pandemic has given people free time, and a lot of people have chosen to spend that free time learning this as a skill, which has pushed it even farther, even faster. Yeah, in terms of just some other things you can use the metadata for, this square that the camera sees, the camera frustum on the screen, once you know the focal length of the lens and the sensor size and the distance to the screen, then you know exactly what the camera can see. And so we can scale the size of that depending on the focal length in real time. Another aspect is Unreal Engine has a function to simulate depth of field. And so if we know the aperture and we know, the relative position of the camera, and we know the focal length and the film back size, everything like that, then we can simulate the correct depth of field in real time. And that's something that's not like a static value, right? Because as you move, that value will change. And as you focus, that value will change, obviously. And so that can all be used just to add that next level of realism and of immersion.
A question came up about film cameras. Do you know of anybody who's used one of these with film yet? Because I think you'd have to be a PIN registered.
I heard about one of my friends trying it. It would definitely have to be PIN registered. It would have to be, I don't know. That's a tricky one. I mean,
the extended data, the lens data is actually generated on a frame by frame basis.
Yeah,
I think it would, but still,
I think it might be quite camera dependent. I think a spinning mirror shutter would be your best bet, but it's like, I'm not quite sure. At that point,
I don't know either. That's actually was a good question, Tony.
Yeah, I mean, can the camera, I assume that there are recent film cameras that can produce a sync out signal. Presumably you can't sync them in, but if they can produce a sync out signal, then you could drive everything from that.
I bet NASA's got one.
Yeah, and potentially
I do. I bet NASA's got a PIN registered sync out camera that's sitting in a closet vault somewhere, because that's what they do. One of the other questions came up about, let's talk about just a variety of metadata that drives all of this. I mean, because it's kind of interesting from that perspective that people have to start thinking about, it's not just lens camera metadata. It's not just file naming and what frame rate it is and everything else. It's what the sync is, what the time code is, but it's also DMX positioning, it's camera positioning in 3D relative space. There's a lot of other things that are now added to this, including lighting densities and that all can be controlled from within Unreal. Yes. And it brings a whole new level of complexity to the process if you don't pay attention to what the metadata is telling you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But it also opens up a lot of possibilities when you do have it. So, like you said, when Unreal can control things like DMX through ArtNet, and it can control cameras through my software reality field and things like that. So, and the blueprint system within Unreal allows you to connect those things together just natively, value to value, and so you can start doing some really interesting things. It is worth pointing out that the value of that metadata, and specifically like lens distortion data and like camera data, white balance, that kind of thing. Obviously, it's critical if you're going to bring it into post, right? And it's important to remember that as hard as we try, there's always going to be shots that are probably going to need to be rotoed and redone in post. It's just the nature of it, right? And so, but at least you can give them a head start. You can give them, frame by frame camera data, distortion data, tracking data, and so it takes a lot of the guesswork out of it for post. Also, again, I mentioned earlier, but with green screens and XR, is still a huge aspect of this industry. And for XR, real-time lens distortion is critical. It's how that works. And so having that is extremely important.
Question from Brad on harmonizing the chroma between the lights and the screens.
Yeah.
That's a whole can of worms that it's like with full spectrum lighting and the lighting that we're using nowadays, pretty much we're holding a control over it. But most lights still have some kind of color deficiency. Do we have that same issue with some of the screens?
Yes. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, LED screens are really bad CRI right now, or SSI. And that's just because they are not meant to be used on camera, right? They were built for events. And so we're in the stage, but like early film LED lights were really bad too. Yeah. And so that's just the stage we're in. They'll get better. The manufacturers really know that this is a market, and they're starting to sort of understand this. As far as like how you calibrate it, a lot of systems right now have like an automated calibration process. So a lot of times, like the skies, for example, you feed in a live feed from your camera, and then it displays a test pattern or a series of test patterns, and it knows what those values are supposed to be, and it knows what the camera's seeing, and it builds a LUT to kind of convert one to the other. Again, you can't create something from nothing. If it's incapable of displaying the wavelengths, then you're just out of luck. Also, something else to consider is off-axis color shifts, because you have a scenario where your LEDs actually have some dimensionality to them. They stick out of the screen a couple millimeters. And so as you get more and more off-axis, your color and your brightness will start to shift. And so that's something you need to keep in mind. If you calibrate for one angle and you primarily are shooting from another, it's not going to line up. But yes, effectively, it's just how it is. Also, different cameras will obviously see the screen in different ways because they have different color sciences.
Another question on camera tracking, because it's like people are having a hard concept of this, of why we would use that kind of system. I mean, and it relates more to the cinematic side of it than it does the broadcast side, because once you take it off a pedestal and you get rock and roll, you'll get angle tilt and different restrictions that are going to show up in how the screens actually work. He's got something there. I want to go for it. Yeah.
No, I'm just gonna. I was gonna pull up. I forgot what I was gonna pull. But yeah, no, it's like you can just go out and shoot a plate and just like display the plate, but you can't move the camera when you do that, because you're gonna run into parallax problems. It's gonna look like a flat plane.
Well, and just so everybody understands what parallax is you have two objects in front of them, and you move the back one, and the front one moves. There's the objects show against each other and how the plane moves. When you have two together, they just kind of go like this, and it's a video. You don't get that separation of objects. There's no planal depth in the environment, and that tracking is what allows that to happen.
Yeah.
Again, we're looking here where you can see the frustum move around behind the actor, but and it's wide because it's a very wide shot. It's he's probably got a 35 millimeter lens, a 40 millimeter lens on. Whereas if you went to a 50 or a 75 in that same environment, you'd be much, much closer to them and it would fill the frame. But the frustum would be much smaller because that part only extends out about 10 or 15% larger than what the field of view is of the lens, which is why this whole metadata thing gets to be important, because you have to know how big the sensor is, which means how big is what the focal length of the lens is and what the focus is, and all of these data sets that define how the image is supposed to look.
Yeah. And you can see as the camera's moving around, you can see that the perspective is changing because this is a real-time, generated 3D environment. And so that is like the secret sauce that makes this that much more convincing compared to just shooting a plate or displaying an image, is that you can walk through your environments. You can move around your environments. That's tricky because this is something that people haven't quite caught up to yet. And I've had DPs ask me, can we go out and shoot plates and things like that? And the answer is, well, no, this is a completely separate system. We have to build this in 3D. It's rendered in real time, but you get all the advantages with that. You can change your lighting, you can change your weather, you can do whatever.
But that doesn't mean that you can't display, plate video on these should you need to.
Yeah, I mean that is the most popular use every day of this, is displaying driving plates for car scenes. Yeah, it's totally reasonable. It's just that you don't have that control. B, you can't move your camera, or not that much. And C, when you're shooting something that's been shot and if you haven't corrected for any of the distortion or anything like that, you're going to get doubled up on all of that. And so it's never going to be 100% perfect. The other thing, Gary mentioned that what the frustum sees is 15% larger. The size of the frustum is 15% larger than what the camera can see. The reason for that, well, there's two reasons for that. One is just latency. There's always some inherent 6 to 8 frame latency in the system, and so as you move the camera around, there's a little bit of delay, and so you need the frustum to be big enough so that you don't see that delay. But also, we can render what the camera sees at a higher resolution than everything else, and put more computer performance into only what's going to be seen, while still having the ambient view for lighting and reflections.
So Stosh said a question about how much time is needed to load all this into Unreal. That's based on your model. The load and unload on Unreal is a different thing, but
yeah,
what's the process that's doing that? Is it, I mean, everybody thinks this is something new, and really it's basically what you did in visual effects before. I mean, it's not that different than how you built visual effects for anything else. Yeah,
no, that's exactly right. The process is really similar. It's just that everything's constructed to work in real time as opposed to an offline renderer. It depends. Like last week, we went out and we 3D scanned LaSalle Street, and it took 3 people about an hour to scan the street, and then it'll take about a week to get that cleaned up and Unreal ready, because it's like 500 million polygons or something right now. And then you have to light it, and if it's something like a city street, you're probably going to want to add in traffic and maybe some pedestrians and things like that.
And all of that work is, it used to be you'd go out and shoot the production and all of the post and the world building and the character development of those kinds of dimensionality would be built after production had finished. In a lot of instances, it might have started concurrently just for simplicity's sake, but for the most part, visual effects were built after production was done. Now we're talking about this is requiring productions to build their visual effects and understand what's going on in advance of production. You're moving at the timeline of where it happens, which means you have to figure out what you want and lock it in beforehand. But on the flip side of that, because you're doing that, and now that you've got tools like Omniverse from NVIDIA that's using real architectural models and physical models for cars and automobiles and those kind of things, you have a different level of control on it. And now you're seeing what it is that you have to build these worlds ahead of time, but you're getting a different reaction from the talent. You're getting real-time reflections that don't have to be modified, and you're delivering, for the most part, camera-ready files to post that only need to be edited. Not all of it works out that way, but this is the way the system will work eventually. And this brings a real interesting part is we're basically taking visual effects and moving it upstream and allowing the process to, modify, filter through, and affect everything downstream. So now the visual effects world is actually going to start affecting what's going on in the real world with actors and talent.
Yeah. And we've all worked, unfortunately, with indecisive, directors, and we know how much of a pain that can be. But if you have someone who is committed to this and who can take advantage of it, the end result and the creative possibilities really are just incredible. Especially compared to like a green screen, for example, where you're on set and no one has any idea what's going on.
Well, I always like to laugh. It's it's Shia LaBeouf staring at Optimus Prime in the Transformers, and he's looking at the bottom of his chin instead of Ferris, because he didn't have the position for the tennis ball correctly. And it's those kinds of things that you're. But it's also the artifice that you would get with little things like for commercial production or advertising work, reflections in objects, glass, metal, those kind of things are then more natural than they would ever been before. And replicating a reflection in glass is what the hardest thing you could possibly do in visual effects. And especially if you've done green screen on it, because you have to pull all the green out and then put all the color back in. But that kind of natural look and natural effect for things, I think, is really going to be advantageous for, environments that we've talked about. It gets back to, I've got 6 hours with a child on set. I can have an entire day to do multiple languages of the same scene on set. I laugh at this because I talk to my friends in India that are working on these things, and they'll go in and shoot, they'll set up a scene and they'll shoot 7 languages in a span of about 3 hours. On the same set with the same actors, they'll just, dialogue 2, dialogue 3, dialogue 4, dialogue 5, and they'll go through that. And they can burn through these scenes that way that is much, much faster than they would do any other way. And that's been one of the places where I've seen a lot of people really take the aspect of planning ahead to the nth degree to make this efficient.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But yes, it is effectively very similar to a VFX workflow, but being moved up. And yeah, that can be a disadvantage depending on the kinds of person that you're working with, if that's their mindset. But I think for most people, if you have a visionary person that you're dealing with, it could be a huge advantage.
Well, that's about it, Andy. Any more questions from anybody? We've been covering, kind of tried to keep them all as we were going along. What parts of the systems are evolving fastest? LED tech, processing power. It's changing daily and weekly. But what do you really think is what's moving the fastest right now?
LED, like I mentioned earlier, but LED panel manufacturers realize that this is a market, and we're starting to see from Planar and Aoto the first sort of specifically targeted for virtual production film LED panels, which is exciting.
What about the one Sony announced? Because they were. Below 2 millimeters. I mean, it was like 1.1 millimeters spacing on them. I mean, it was the same dot pitch as some of their larger crystal screens. So it was like, and that brings up an interesting thing too, because at the Sony announcement, they started talking about how the Venice camera can actually marry directly into their display systems to real time do that. Pomford is now talking about having a color grading, live grade capabilities for in display, because this is one of the problems with the color balance in all of this technology is that you have to go through Unreal's proprietary tools to balance the screen. You don't have a LUT box in the middle that you can adjust all of this with. You've got to tweak it. And the technology is all wrong. I mean, the one thing I like to remind everybody is Z space in Unreal is not forwards and backwards. It's up and down. So it's like you have to rethink everything in your environment, because we've been Z is distance, forever, and now all of a sudden it's not. And it's a confusing as hell to most of us. Yes.
Yeah, no, but like aside from that, it's a lot of other systems, camera tracking solutions, but also like we were talking about earlier, the metadata solutions, lens encoders, for example, those are all just rapidly evolving, and software support software packages as well. The systems that sort of hook into Unreal, media server systems that hook into Unreal, for example, and provide new functionality, are actively being developed, and are I am beta testing 2 major ones right now, and they're really exciting. They open up a lot of possibilities. So,
well, and the screens make it give impact for actors, because actors can now see it. Sylvania asked how people liked it, the actors like it, and every actor I've talked to that's worked on a volume loves it dearly because it's simpler, it's easier, it's easier to take care of. Somebody asked about education. Hollywood Reporter posted today, but I think Monday, the Organization for Cinema Broadcast in the UK announced that virtual production will be part of all cinema programs from this point forward.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's not taken long for this to happen. I mean, in Chicago, I know of both film schools, both DePaul and Columbia College are both putting in virtual stages. There'll be 5 up before, spring of next year in the city of Chicago alone. I know of at least 3 in Toronto, 1 in Edmonton. I've helped with a couple of them, and there's 4 or 5 in Vancouver right now. I mean, Stargate Studios, who's based in Vancouver, has got a huge operation there too. So.
And they use my hardware.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, it's taking up, but also like Unreal Engine has a ton of educational resources. Again, it's all free. But also, like I was saying earlier, a lot of traditional VFX.
I think from that one, Greg might have been asking more from an educator's perspective, how to tackle this and break it down to teach the students. He may be with a local school.
Yeah, Greg. First of all, I tell everybody go to unreal.com, and go to Epic and look at it. There is a huge amount, literally terabytes of video applications and programming and how to do all of this. They, have really excelled at being able to develop a workflow and a program. If you want to learn one specific part of it, you want to learn just Blueprint or something else, they've got videos that relate to that. And it's the best place to start. If you're in an education environment, talk to somebody who's working in gaming, because if you're working in gaming, you know all of this.
Yes.
And world builders are going to be important parts of the future in all of this. You're going to need somebody who understands all of this, but can then translate it. I mean, you can't get a game programmer who's hides in a corner and doesn't want to talk to anybody to drag them on set and make them work. That doesn't happen. You have to have somebody who actually has the mindset and wants to work in this kind of environment. Yeah. One of the other questions popped up. Tony asked about technology outdoor ready, and no.
Probably that kind of defeats the purpose, I would say. And now there are LED panels that are outdoor rated, that are waterproof, but you probably don't want to do this outside. It's not.
But they're really good for lighting. You can use them for lighting effects, and you can use them for the reflections and things like that. If you need a really, really bright reflection on a light sunny day, those outdoor panels are used for that and very effective in that aspect. So
yeah, absolutely. Virtual Unreal for previs, yeah, of course, absolutely. But
it's not a separate application. It's still just Unreal.
Same program. Yeah. That's one of the really common uses of it. It's been used for previs for longer than it's been used for virtual production. Unity is also really popular for previs. I'm a part of the Unity beta group, and they are developing a lot of systems to even further themselves in that market as well, which is exciting. But yeah, no, it's great. And the cool thing about Unreal and Unity is they deal with physical values, right? So you can type in foot candles, and you can type in millimeters for focal length, and centimeters for distance and things like that. So you can then specifically see the actual physical relationships of things in a previous scenario, which is awesome.
Yeah, it's interesting to have, if you're not an engineer, to go in and start playing with it, and you have start understanding a whole lot more about how light reflections and everything. And when we get to the ray tracing side of that part of lighting that you said you had to bake in, when we get to that in the next version of this, where we're getting dynamic effects of lighting, it's going to be real interesting to see how much processing power that really takes. I mean, how many NVIDIA cards are we going to have to jam into each box to be able to get it to, generate 50 million particles in a sparkle effect, or, a bug running across the ceiling when you're doing that kind of stuff. It's real interesting that's the next level of technology. So. It's
going to be crazy initially, but, it's going to get better with time. And I'm always somebody who hates it when people try and stop progress because of those kinds of things, right? Just because your computer can't run something doesn't mean that it shouldn't be made. That's I think a bad attitude to have. So I'm excited for what the future holds, regardless of whether or not my computer is going to melt.
It only melts so far. Mine hasn't gone through the desk yet. It did deform the wood to my desk. But,
it can only become so liquid
until it bursts into flames. We say that jokingly. I haven't had one do that yet, but yes, they do. So it's a computer. So
I have an EVGA 3090, which are literally known to die, kill themselves and die. So that's fun.
Yeah, I'm running all different cards in mine, so it's interesting to see that. So.
All right, I think we're going to just give a last call. Does anyone have any last questions to fire in here for the fellas? Not looking like it. Gary, Andy, on behalf of Silvino, Jeff, myself, and the whole section, Tony, our chair, of course, thank you so much for sharing your expertise today and for your time. The membership here certainly values the education, and we thank you for that. With that, I think we're ready to sign off. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great night, and we sure hope to start seeing you in person before too long.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
It's fun. Have a good one.
Okay, I should have this the slide. Am I
Yeah,
on?
go ahead. Yeah,
Okay.
you're on.
Cool. So yeah, thanks guys. Yeah, really, really great. It's always nice to partake in some new technology and as I would say, make your head explode, because there's so many different things that are going on, and it's really great to kind of see that technology. As far as this meeting was recorded or is being recorded, and we'll have it posted on the YouTube channel very shortly. It will take about a week because we do a little bit of cleanup and things of that nature. For future meetings, November the 9th, we're looking at possibly doing some edge computing, streaming. We're still trying to lock that down. But the date looks like it's going to be the 9th. It could move, but you'll get notice if it does move. December the 14th, we're still trying to lock that one down, but we're also trying to see whether or not that might be one of our first face-to-face meetings, and we're just trying to figure out the logistics behind that, whether or not there is a venue that we can partake in. But again, do stay tuned, and we'll get you more information on that. January's meeting, we're going to do a joint meeting with the Western Canada subsection. So we'll get something going there in February. Again, every February for the last couple of years have been student focused. So we're really trying to just hone into the students and some of their interest in topics and things of that nature. So we'll be looking for presenters and the likes for that. Here's the information to keep us informed with you guys. There's our website, simply.org/Toronto or /Toronto. If you want to become a friend and get meeting notices and general email blasts from us, that's the URL that you would go and visit. And again, Facebook, Twitter, and our email address. Yeah, that's it. Again, with this COVID still running around and the third wave, be well, stay safe, and we'll call this a wrap. Thanks very much, everybody, and for joining us, and really appreciate it.